Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My husband of almost 15 years has high-functioning autism. We have 2 children, and our oldest son is 13, and he also has high-functioning autism. The biggest conflict that we run into is with his mother, my husband's mother. She is very opinionated, very strong-headed, and my husband wasn't diagnosed with autism until about 4 years ago. And so she is just not educated about it at all. And she really refuses to see him with autism. But it's very obvious if she spent more time with him. We do live 12 hours from her. The biggest issue we have is she sees that our oldest son is different. He does not go with the flow very easily. And so she gets very upset that he doesn't easily do what she wants. And so she does push him aside. She even told us that he brings out the worst in her. So there's many hurtful things that she has said. And it's been a while since we've seen her because of COVID. And so it brings a lot of anxiety upon me being around her, because I feel like I have to defend my children, and my husband really struggles with standing up to them. He's very scared of disappointing or standing up to his parents, especially his mother. He wants to, but he's not quite sure how to do it because words just don't come easily to him, especially under pressure. So how can I help him to learn to stand up for me and his children?
Okay, thanks for the question. And one of the first things that we need to think of is the business of guilt. And so your mother-in-law has discovered that both her son and her grandson have an autism spectrum disorder. It's not too surprising that there might be some initial denial, because there could be some guilt associated with that, what I would just call false guilt, because she might be thinking, well, if they have autism, maybe that's something I did. Maybe it's something that I did wrong while I was pregnant, or maybe I was a bad parent in some shape, form, or fashion. So she may be blaming herself, even at an unconscious level, and that's too painful of a realization. And also it's inaccurate, and so some of that denial is protection against the thought that, must have been my fault. So, high-functioning autism, also called ASD level 1, is often mentioned in the media, television, newspapers, social networks, and whatnot. But the truth is that besides remembering Dustin Hoffman's performance in the movie Rain Man as an autistic savant, most people really have no clue about what an autism spectrum disorder is. They think of it as some kind of a disease or something that is going to be debilitating over the lifespan, when in fact people on the autism spectrum have way more strengths than they do weaknesses, and often excel more than typical people. So you'd want to assure your mother-in-law and other family members, as far as that goes, that even though there's no single cause or cure for high-functioning autism, it is certainly treatable. Although it is a lifelong disorder, studies show that early diagnosis and intervention can lead to significant improved outcomes. So with the support of your mother-in-law and other family members, along with appropriate services, your 13-year-old son will definitely live a full, healthy, and meaningful life, no doubt about that. Another thing you'll want to do is explain to your mother-in-law that different circumstances call for different parenting. So explain that while you're trying to give your son as normal an environment as possible, there may be things that you'll do or not do for him that you would for the other children in the family. For example, there may be different rules and consequences. There might be different sleeping arrangements, different dietary or safety concerns. So you may want to gently explain that this doesn't mean that you're playing favorites or that you're babying your son. You're simply addressing his unique needs and protecting him from unnecessary stress. Also, I would encourage you to not be offended. You would want to ensure your mother-in-law and other family members that your son's lack of social interactions with them is simply par for the course and not a personal affront. After all, high-functioning autism is, in essence, a disorder of social skills. Also, there's nothing wrong with you encouraging your mother-in-law to discuss her fears, disappointments, confusion, concerns, whatever's going on. Remember the feelings that you had when you first heard that your son had high-functioning autism, and then later when you heard that your husband had it. So realize that your mother-in-law will most likely experience similar emotions. It would also be good to give your mother-in-law some information about HFA, but only on a need-to-know basis, because if you bombard her with a ton of information, that's going to maybe even make her more confused and even more alarmed. So, for example, you may want to just skip the nitty-gritty details of a gluten-free, casein-free diet. You may want to postpone telling stories about HFA children who run away or who still aren't potty trained by age 8. And you want to offer her a short list of internet sources. What we're dealing with here is not your mother-in-law purposely trying to be insensitive or uncaring. It's just lack of information. So with a few internet sources that she can research, she can explore the world of autism spectrum disorders at her own pace. Also, in a very diplomatic way, you would want to remind her the importance of accepting your son for who he is, not who she hoped he was supposed to be. Children on the autism spectrum do need more space. They need more understanding and patience. And lastly, if she simply doesn't get it, then you could suggest a support group. If your mother-in-law or any other extended family members for that matter have difficulty understanding or accepting the diagnosis, then they really should consider getting in touch with a support group in order to hear other families' stories, because there's other grandmothers, mother-in-laws, moms, and so on that have been there and done that and had denial and resistance in the beginning, but now have come to some form of acceptance. And hearing those stories from other families who have been down that road can be very reassuring. So sometimes when your neurotypical spouse is, quote, nagging, complaining, getting angry with you, unquote, it often downloads in the ASD brain as, I'm not good enough, she's being critical of me, she's trying to control me, etc. So in other words, we'll use the example of the husband with autism spectrum disorder, are taking her comments very personally. You're taking her behavior as a personal affront. But what's really going on there, at some level, has very little to do with you specifically or with you alone. It's about the situation. It's the circumstance that is troubling to your NT wife. Her goal is not to control you, to change you, to fix you, to put you down and make you feel like shit. Her goal is to change the circumstances. In other words, the two of you were on the same team initially. Over time, you drifted apart. She's trying to get you back on the team. So even though it's understandable why her complaints would download as criticism to you, it's not. Her motivation is not to belittle you or to make you feel like a child. She's not trying to change you, she's trying to change the situation. So the next time your NT wife complains, nags, registers concerns, goes on a long monologue about how she is hurt, instead of taking that as a personal attack against you, take that as her strong desire to change the situation. It's not about you solely. It's about a predicament that she is in that leaves her feeling abandoned. The challenges facing some women who are married to a man with Asperger's or high-functioning autism can be difficult to navigate. These challenges may be completely hidden to other family members, friends, and co-workers. No one seems to understand what the wife struggles with. Her husband may seem to be a good guy who appears perfectly normal to everyone else. Being married to a man on the autism spectrum may be filled with a predictable, progressive pattern that goes from joyful to puzzled to irritated to angry and finally to hopeless. In the beginning, the wife may have been swept off her feet and ravished with affection and attention. She was the primary focus of her boyfriend's life. His obsession with the relationship felt romantic and intoxicating. But after a few years of marriage, this feeling may have faded. The waning of affection is not conscious on the Asperger's husband's part. He's most likely not even aware that this has happened. However, as time goes on, the wife may experience certain negative emotions associated with her husband's need to find interesting activities in places outside of the relationship. Examples of these emotions can include the following. Hopelessness. When the wife's best effort to resolve the ongoing relationship difficulties goes nowhere, a lack of hope may permeate the relationship and lead to a separation or divorce. Rejection. Men on the autism spectrum are often consumed by their special interest. They may be chronically distracted by this interest and find it difficult to pay attention to their wife. This may lead her to feel neglected, or it can be misinterpreted as disinterest on the part of her husband. Resentment. This emotion becomes prevalent when the wife feels ignored, disregarded, disrespected, and alone in the relationship. Some wives will respond to this by becoming very angry and yelling at their husband, while others will shut down and block out all emotions, with the possible exception of sadness and depression. Extreme fatigue. As the wife tries to compensate for the lack of equal sharing or follow-through in responsibilities, she often feels exhausted. In her mind, no amount of effort appears to resolve the problems that continue to plague the relationship. Due to the inconsistency in her husband's willingness to take responsibility for things and feelings of being burdened with more than her fair share of tasks, more feelings of exhaustion and tension are manifest. Feeling devalued. Wives of Asperger's husbands often get the feeling that all their good suggestions and advice are not taken to heart. This may cause the wife to come to the conclusion that her ideas, opinions, wants, and needs are worthless to her husband. Disappointment. In the viewpoint of the wife, the same kinds of problems keep presenting themselves over and over again. She has tried to discuss the issues in question, and she has tried to make herself understood, yet the same problems persist. Feeling isolated. Because her husband seems disinterested in what she has to say and appears to ignore her, it's easy to understand why the wife may feel lonely. Since the husband with Asperger's or high-functioning autism may not even be aware that the marriage has changed for the worse, he doesn't understand why his wife is always so demanding and bitchy. Her increasing dissatisfaction, resentment, and complaints only further damage any chances of communication and intimacy because the husband feels that he can never do anything right, and he too may even feel unloved. The negative downward spiral that we just looked at may be avoided when both spouses understand the way Asperger's symptoms are affecting the relationship. It is indeed very possible to learn different behaviors to heal these kinds of wounds. So one thing that often comes up when I'm working with neurotypical women in a relationship with a man on the autism spectrum, or vice versa, is she will say, I try to talk to him and he doesn't get it. I keep going over the same thing again and again and again. He doesn't get it. I keep trying to tell him what the problem is and what he can do to help alleviate the problem. He still doesn't get it. And so with this business of problem solving, what you're running into, if you're not getting the problem resolved, is you guys aren't agreeing on what the problem is. I run into this every time, as in 100%. She will go, when she's talking to him, well, the problem is this. And he'll go, no, that's not the problem. The real problem is that. And she will go, what? Are we on the same planet? No. This is the problem. I'm telling you, that's the problem. And he goes, no, that is not the problem. You're wrong. This is the problem. So you see where this gets nowhere, because the two of you can't even agree on what the freaking problem is to begin with. So the first step in problem solving, which doesn't even get to the desired result, because you have to first establish some kind of a bond or some kind of a trust that we are going to just worry about identifying the problem. Let's don't worry about solving it just yet. Let's just see if we can identify it. So that would be the first step. Now, I understand in some cases the two of you are just going to disagree what the problem is, and that's fine as long as you agree that you're going to disagree on what the problem is, but we still have found the problem. It's just now the problem is 1A and 1B. So it's still, in a sense, just one problem. It's just a two-pronged problem. So anyway, this is the deal that I run into is you guys are first going to have to somewhat agree on what the problem is, and then move from there. But if you say the problem is A, and he goes, no, the problem is B, and you try to compromise, negotiate, have a meeting of the minds based on two versions of the problem, most often that's going to be a fail, because he's going to want to resolve problem B while you're trying to resolve problem A, and since the two of you aren't working together, the rest is history. The problem doesn't get solved.
Hey guys, this is Mark, and I wanted to specifically talk to the guys on the autism spectrum in this video. In the men's group, the therapy group that we do, we get into some of the traits of the disorder that get in the way of relationships, and we talk about mind blindness, alexithymia, some executive functions deficits, and of course anxiety. But I wanted to narrow it down in this video because I find that guys on the autism spectrum, people in general, wouldn't necessarily have to be men, do tend to have some thinking errors because of the mind blindness stuff. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes and go into some greater detail with that, because I keep getting a lot of questions about thinking errors. So on that note, I'm going to talk about some of these. Let's talk briefly about all or nothing thinking. And so this would be where you think in absolute terms, pretty much black and white thinking, okay? And you'll know if you're engaging in this all or nothing thinking if you use terms like always, every, never, like you always do this, or every time this happens, blah, 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 or I never, blah, 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 and so on. For instance, let's say you get, you get a bad report from your boss, you know, he was disappointed in something that you did, and so you view yourself as a total failure, okay? You did 110 things right, and the one thing you did wrong, you're going to consider that, well, because I did make a mistake at work and got reprimanded by my boss there. That would be an example of all or nothing thinking. Catastrophizing. Now, this would be where you focus on the worst possible outcome, even though that outcome may be like very, very unlikely. Or you think about a situation, another version of catastrophizing would be thinking that a situation is unbearable or impossible when really it's just uncomfortable. So you're kind of exaggerating the difficulty. Does that make sense? And now let's look at the business of disqualifying the positive. So here you continually shoot down positive experiences for very arbitrary and impromptu reasons. So in this way, you can maintain a negative belief that is contradicted by your everyday experiences. So, for example, the fact that I am an excellent artist doesn't count because everything else about my life sucks. So that would be an example of disqualifying the positive. Let's look at emotional reasoning now. This would be when the individual makes decisions and arguments even based on how he feels rather than on objective reality. So what you're doing here with emotional reasoning is you're saying, because I feel this way, therefore it is a fact. Now let's look at fortune telling. This is anticipating things, just expecting that things will turn out badly. And this is where the person feels convinced that his prediction is already an established fact. So, for example, because I think that I will fail to make, let's say that there is a particular advancement at work that you are wanting. And it's a step up the ladder and it's a little more pay. But you say, for example, because I think that I will fail at getting to that next rung on the corporate ladder, I most certainly will fail. Right? Because I think I will fail, therefore I will fail. So I'm basically assuming that my thoughts, in this case, can predict the future. Okay, let's go to jumping to conclusions. Now, this is assuming something negative where there is actually no evidence to support it. Let's say, for example, and again, I'm kind of talking to the guys on the autism spectrum here, and it seems I'm using the examples of kind of work-related stuff, really. So let's say, for example, your coworkers, maybe they're not as friendly to you as you would like, and so you make the sweeping generalization that none of your peers, none of your coworkers like you. But you really don't really have any evidence that that is the case. So again, with jumping to conclusions, you're assuming something negative when really there's really no actual evidence to support that. And you might even talk to one of your coworkers and say to him, I don't feel like anybody here likes me. And this one coworker that you're confiding in goes, no, everybody here likes you. I've never heard anybody say one bad thing about you. So let's move on to labeling now. Now this involves explaining by naming. So rather than describing the specific behavior, the individual assigns a label to someone or himself that puts the other person or himself in absolute and unalterable negative terms. I'm going to make up another example. A good statement that would coincide with labeling would be if you say something along the lines of, my coworker won't talk to me, therefore he is a jerk, or therefore he is a narcissist. So you're basically labeling people based on your perception of their behavior. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on now to magnification. Now this basically involves exaggerating the negatives. So you may have had 10 things go right for you today. One thing goes wrong at the end of the day, and so you view the entire day as a disaster. So this involves exaggerating the negatives, and really what coincides with that is ignoring the positives. So mental filter, it's the next one. This is focusing exclusively on certain aspects of something while ignoring the rest. For instance, let's say the individual selectively hears the one tiny negative thing surrounded by all the big positive things. I'll use the example of, let's say your boss makes 9 positive comments about your project and one little slight constructive criticism there at the very end, but you obsess about that one little short piece of constructive criticism that he threw in at the very end of a long list of really praising you for good work. Mind reading. This involves assuming the intentions of others. You just presume that you know what they're up to. For example, the individual may arbitrarily conclude that his peer is thinking negatively of him, but even though you're thinking that, you don't bother to check it out and actually ask. So let's see, we've got mind reading. I'm sorry, we just did that one. Minimization. This involves understating the positives. Enough said about that. Overgeneralization. So this is taking isolated cases and using them to make sweeping generalizations. For example, let's say the individual views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. Okay? He views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. For example, my wife just yelled at me. She's always yelling at me, therefore she must not like me. So there's a perfect example of overgeneralization. Let's go on to personalization now. Now this occurs when the person holds himself personally responsible for an event that really isn't entirely under his control. Okay? I'm going to make up a ridiculous example. Let's say your parents got divorced when you were a teenager. And so you say, my parents got divorced, it must be because I was a bad son. Or my NT wife seems to be upset, therefore it must have something to do with me. And so you're just assuming that you're the one, that you're the cause of somebody else's behavior. And the last one we're going to look at is shoulding. And this is when the person focuses on what he cannot control. For example, he concentrates on what he thinks should or ought to be, rather than the actual situation he is faced with. And if you use the term should a lot, oh, I should have done that, or I shouldn't have done this. Or you can use the shoulding with other people. You shouldn't do that, or you should do that, or you must do this. That's an example of shoulding. So there we have the 14 thinking errors that tie into, at some level, the mind blindness issue. And so I basically just wanted to go into further detail in that. Often I don't have time to do that in group. I wanted to do that in this video. Speaking of men's group, feel free to email me. If you want to register for the next men's group coming up. And be glad to have you. This is a men's only group. You don't necessarily have to be on the autism spectrum to join that group. It usually has several men in there where they suspect that they do, but they haven't necessarily had a formal diagnosis. So, okay. So I think that'll be it for now, guys. Feel free to ask any questions underneath the video, and I'll try to find time to answer those at some point. Thanks.
Okay, so I've been getting some questions from NT wives, and they're wanting to know, I'm just kind of paraphrasing what some of the questions are like. They're wanting to know why they cannot get their husband with autism spectrum disorder to get it, quote unquote. That being, it's hard for them to convey to him how important it is to be emotionally reciprocal, to spend time with them, to make her feel important, and so on. And so they've pleaded and argued and complained and tried to be nice and tried to be tougher and all these different things, and they still say, I can't get him to get it. But just remember that you're probably employing a traditional approach that would work with the neurotypical brain. If you were trying to plead with somebody else, let's say a neurotypical coworker, and you use the method that you're using with your ASD husband, the NT coworker would probably get it and would want to cooperate with you. But the method that most NTs use to try to get their ASD husband to connect, it actually makes a bad problem worse in many cases, because it downloads in his mind as she's being parental and punitive. And this often raises his anxiety level, which in turn exacerbates the very symptoms of the disorder that you're annoyed with, namely low on empathy. So the paradox is due to some of the traits of the disorder, specifically executive function, theory of mind deficits, and weak central coherence. We'll take a brief look at each of those. And this is basically, these are the three main traits that get in the way of the NT trying to establish a connection with her husband with Asperger's or high-functioning autism. So the first thing is executive function. Now, this can be defined as a way in which people monitor and control their thoughts and actions. It's actually a broad category that includes processes such as working memory, planning, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is one aspect of executive function, and it's the ability to restrain or inhibit potentially interfering responses and to self-regulate in certain situations. And if your husband can't self-regulate during difficult conversations with you, what that looks like is he either shuts down or melts down. And the second thing that gets in the way of her trying to establish a connection is theory of mind deficits. Theory of mind is the ability that we all have in order to make sense of the world we live in. You know, every person's thoughts, knowledge, beliefs, and desires make up his or her own unique theory of mind. From the ages around 4 years or so, typical kids, those without autism, understand that other people have their own thoughts. They have their own knowledge base, beliefs, and desires that will influence their behavior. However, people on the autism spectrum appear to have some difficulties conceptualizing the thoughts and feelings of others, and that downloads as lack of empathy in the neurotypical wife's mind. Since he has difficulty conceptualizing and appreciating her thoughts and feelings, she therefore makes the leap of logic that he evidently doesn't care, and he's selfish, narcissistic, and so on. So it is this mind blindness that may impair people on the autism spectrum to be able to relate to and understand the behavior of others. Mind blindness also means that, in this case, the ASD husband has difficulty in distinguishing whether someone's actions are intentional or accidental. So by failing to account for others' perspectives, people on the autism spectrum tend to misinterpret their messages. And many of the social skills deficits observed in people on the autism spectrum have their genesis in the lack of ability to decipher subtle meaning from the environment. For example, facial cues, body language, tone of voice, wordage, and so on. And then the third and last trait that gets in the way of the NT wife making a true connection as she would like is central coherence, and this is the ability to focus on both details as well as the big picture. So people with autism spectrum disorder appear to have a heightened focus on details rather than the big picture. And this is a cognitive style termed weak central coherence. Now, this is the reason in this case, the ASD man has hypersensitivities to sensory perceptions. So the inability to hold information in mind in order to use it later in other tasks is what causes the person with ASD to lack central coherence. A lack of cognitive central coherence can easily cause, in this case, the ASD husband, to miss important and subtle cues that create meaning in a social context. So with these three traits that I just listed, central coherence, theory of mind, executive function, I don't really understand what might be in the mind of my NT wife in this case, what she might be thinking, and then what she might be feeling based on her thinking, and then why she behaves the way she does based on her feeling. And I don't understand her opinions, I don't understand her perspective, and sometimes her feelings are utter nonsense to me because I don't have an emotional vocabulary. I'm out of touch with my feelings, and therefore I'm out of touch with her feelings as well. So, long way around the bush to describe this, but in a nutshell, you have the NT wife who is highly social and highly emotional, and then you have the ASD man who is low perhaps in social skills and emotionality, but very high in logic. And so she appeals to him through emotions and from social competencies, while he tries to appeal to her through logic. She's speaking German, he's speaking French, and they don't understand one another.